are going to be delivered too. Women and children are going to be delivered too. You know, so it's going to be a lot of things that's happening in the spirit for the on the behalf of the elect.
A lot of miracles.
Yeah, miracles that's coming too. It says, "Verily I say unto you, that there be some."
Yeah, because faith is going to be increased.
Yeah.
Our faith, man, is going to be increased to where it's going to come to a point where it's not can't even be held in these bodies.
Yeah. The faith is going to get to a point where it's going to bound. Where the scriptures speak about that, the path of the just is as a shining light that shineth more and more into the perfect day.
That's right.
The perfect day is when Yahweh shall return. So that light that's in us, the candle, got to get brighter and brighter. Can't let it get put out. You got to shine more. You got to turn it up. You know.
Yep. You can't let it be dimmed.
So it says, "Verily I say unto you, that there be some of them."
Shalom. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to the only true God of heaven and earth, whose name is Yahweh, and to his only begotten Son, the Messiah, whose name is Yahweh Shai. Double honors to my elders and teachers in Great Millstone, and honors to all the prophets and teachers that carry the spirit of faith and truth. My name is Zechariah. Hear my speech concerning truth. That is the word of the living God. The focus of this lesson will be concerning the power of God that will ultimately be magnified in you, believers, in times of difficulty and hardship, in times of trouble, times that will ultimately come very soon, a time of mass death, economic disruption, famines, plagues sent by God, a time of loss, a time of war. And in these times that are ultimately prophetic, the power of God, the power of Yahweh Shai, HaMashiach, will work best before you, within you, promoting more faith and hope and virtue, which virtue means moral goodness, in some cases moral excellence. The excellence of the mind and soul. As you heard from the prophets that I played at the beginning of the video, they spoke on faith ultimately increasing. Now, through my time in this truth, I've learned that faith is a product of God's divine power. It's not something that resteth upon you, that's mustered up within you, that's conjured up within or by your own spirit. Really, it's conjured up by God's spirit. In fact, faith is likened unto a gift. And a gift is what? Something that is given freely, not something that is earned or taken, but something that is given freely. In this case, is a gift bestowed by God's grace. And they're right. It will be increased. Which when I heard what they said, when I was watching the video, I had to take that video and use it for this lesson. It reminded me of Yahweh Shai's word unto Paul in his low points. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. In fact, let's just read verse 9. Jump straight to the point. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. So this is what Yahweh Shai said unto the Apostle Paul. And he said it, spiritually unto Paul. Now, I cannot tell you whether Yahweh Shai appeared unto Paul, but ultimately, this was an exhortation sent by Yahweh Shai. And in this, chapter is written in red letter. So this wasn't Paul, own words. He heard these, received these words from Yahweh Shai himself, even though Yahweh Shai is not among us, or wasn't among the earth at that time, because he have already, finished his work. But this is relevant unto us as well. In our point of weaknesses, that's when the power of Yahweh Shai worketh best. In fact, let's go into that word perfect real quick. It's from the Greek word
Strong's G 5048. Teleao. Teleao.
which means to be made perfect, complete, to be found perfect, to fulfill. Basically, in other words, to make full. So in our point of weaknesses, just as it was with Paul, his power is made perfect. And as I said, faith is not a thing of ourselves. It's a thing of God's divine power and spirit. In fact, it tells you in the book of Corinthians, Paul said it according to the spirit of power of God. He said that, faith is a gift. It's an actual thing conjured up by that divine spirit of God. It's a result of divine presence within you. So Yahweh Shai's strength being made perfect, what that also, can result in. It can result in your faith being strengthened, being increased. Consider the faith of those before us. Women, believers, saints, women who were upright before God, who saw their sons being mutilated and murdered before their very eyes for being faithful unto God, but had the strength to endure these atrocities and continue in the faith, even dying themselves. That's a type of strength that cometh not by our own spirit, but from the heavens. See, I did a lesson in past time concerning the power of God and how it manifests throughout the different ages of time. You know, we know about the flooding. We know about the raining down of fire from heaven. We know about the angels blinding men. We know about animals speaking. We know about the stopping of water. You know, the Red Sea, that men may walk upon dry ground. We know about the Lord opening the earth to devour the enemies. You know, these different accounts written in the Bible. You know, manifestations of God's power. But there's other ways how God's power is manifested. Ways that may not be as visible and apparent, but still of that same power. For example, men who were willing, or shall I say able, to be burnt alive in a brazen bull. And I'm talking about Antipas, Yahushua mentioned in the book of Revelation, and called him a faithful martyr. And when you read that historical account, he was literally burnt alive in a brazen bull. How can a man take that? How can a man endure that? What type of spirit do a man need to have in order to endure that? That's a spirit that is of God, ultimately. A power, a strength that is of God. Will make a man resist kings and pharaohs. Consider Moses, a man who stood strong and resisted Pharaoh. That's a strength and a power that is of God. You know, so faith, it is a manifestation of God's power. And as it is written, his strength is made perfect in weakness. So when Yahushua, basically, our faith is going to be promoted, man. To back up what those prophets said. That is true. And no wonder that also will be a time where miracles will be seen and experienced according to the Lord's divine power as well. Because by faith, that power worketh. Let's say it again. By faith, that power worketh. Consider those that were healed by Yahushua. They were healed by that power, but through their faith. In fact, something that always stuck with me, what Yahushua said, one of the scriptures that, keep with me the most. According to your faith, it shall be done. Yahushua was said to those whom he will heal. So he will heal these different people according to their faith. So that power will be working amongst us promoting faith and, doing these miracles and delivering us according to our faith. Even prayers concerning the impossible. The Lord will ultimately put the Spirit on you believers to pray for things that you probably wouldn't even regularly pray as of now. Let me say that again. The Lord will put the Spirit on you believers to pray for things that you probably wouldn't even pray for right now. Prayers, for, asking God for things that may be impossible. That may be unimaginable. That may be against, the laws of reality. Whether that be, healing, don't put that off the table. It is written in the book of Corinthians, the Spirit distributeth the gift of faith. Among the churches, that gift, it will be very well alive and active. And I'm talking about the type of, healing where, it will happen not just in a couple of days, because the gift of healing, which is of the Spirit, it is, manifested, still it is active, but on a whole nother level it's going to be active. You have some cases where, a believer may be sick, or have something going on with their body, and they, the elders and the prophets, or members of, their camp may pray for them, anoint them with oil, and ultimately they get healed the next day or a couple of days after. I'm talking about, which, that's, that gift of faith, that gift of healing is still as active. But I'm talking about on a whole nother level, to the point where you may be able to heal a lame man, someone with a disability. A type of healing where, a blind can see. A type of healing that is striking, So these things will be promoted. These different gifts, gift of faith and gift of healing, miracles, will ultimately be promoted, in these times of weakness, of difficulty, of hardship. I want to go to the book. In fact, let's finish the scripture. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Mashiach may rest upon me. So that's when the power of Mashiach worketh best. Or is multiplied, is magnified in those times of hardship and difficulty. Verse 10, it says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Mashiach's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. So we're going to be strong, brothers and sisters. We're going to be strong. And disregard not the strength of divine power. Of the inward, that is manifested inwardly. Don't disregard that strength. Don't disregard the power of God that's manifested inwardly. Because, being in his flesh, sometimes we always look to the outward and the apparent and the visibly striking, works of God, and manifestations of his divine power. Sometimes we forget the ones that's working within us mentally, morally. Sometimes we forget that type of form of manifestation. And fear not, about ultimately the persecutions that's going to come, and the trials of the faith that's going to come. I mentioned Antipas. Hearing, when you read that, when you come to know about his trial, some will fear, but looking at it at a spiritual perspective, that divine power was with him, to endure that, that divine power had to be with him. And so it will be with you believers, to refrain from taking the mark and worshiping the image of the beast, from getting down with that system and fashion of that evil fashion and agenda of Esau's. That's you're going to need the power and spirit of God with you, to be willing to face imprisonment and decapitation, which that's prophetic to happen, that's prophesied to happen for some of the believers. Some will have to be martyred. It's prophetic, but the Spirit of God will be with you, type of divine power that make your knees stand straight and strong in the midst of death, instead of shaking and falling to your feet and to your knees. Type of power that make your knees stand strong and your shoulders stand upright. Let's go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 25. It says, for she is the breath of the power of God and a pure influence flowing from the glory of the Almighty. Therefore can no the foul thing fall into her. Now, in the Gospels, it is written that Yahweh Shai is the power of God and the wisdom of God. The Heavenly Father Yahweh have given him absolute power and authority in heaven and in earth. He have given Yahweh Shai omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. The Heavenly Father have lifted Yahweh Shai onto godhood, the perfection of godhood. So Yahweh Shai, he handles the absolute power of God in his hand. So Yahweh Shai will be there. It says, for she is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God, and the image of his goodness. That's the point out that I wanted to get. And being but one, she can do all things. And remaining in herself, she maketh all things new. And in all ages, entering into holy souls, she maketh them friends of God and prophets. So it's an actual influence and actual power that we cannot physically see with our visible eyes. You know, a collection of angels, of holy angels, that are very present and active that we cannot physically see with our eyes. Which the angels, they are the many aspects of God's power. You know, they handle the operations of God. And there's millions and millions of them. You know? And guess what? Yahweh Shai is over those angels. So in every situation, every difficulty, that divine power that is so massive, and overflowing and abundant beyond measure, will be there for you elect within you and in the midst of you. They tell you when you read up, verse 24, for wisdom is more moving than any motion. So it's a mobile, active, you know, a spiritual force that we cannot see. Now with the physical eye, neither with a carnal mind. With a spiritual mind, you will be able to see and understand and witness, you know. To those who are spiritual, this very ministry is a display of God's power. To those who are spiritual, the number of prophets and teachers that's teaching daily is a display of God's power. The number of believers that have woken up and being enlightened is a display of God's power. You know, to the physical eyes, it's look as though as a mortal, you know, worldly movement of men. You know, like it's some social movement, but to the spiritual is bigger than that. But the point that I'm trying to make is an active divine force. Let's go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, verse 13. Now this is pertaining to Joseph. It says, when the righteous were sold, you know, he was sold into slavery by his brothers because they envied him. So when Joseph was sold, it says she forsook him not, but delivered him from sin. She went down with him into the pit. So that divine influence. Now, I want to note, When the scriptures speak about wisdom in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7 and 10, it's not talking about the intellectual wisdom. It's more pertaining to the divine power and God's goodness and influence. In fact, I've read it in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. So it's framed as God's power and divine influence. That have different, ultimately, that operates in different ways, such as the giving of the law. Is a product of God's divine power and influence and goodness. The temple, the tabernacle was a product of God's divine power and influence. We have different operations and influences, what shall I say, effects, shall I say. But, I want to note, when it speaks about wisdom, when it speaks about she, it's more representing God's divine power and goodness. So let's read. It says, when the righteous was sold, she forsook him not, but delivered him from sin. She went down with him into the pit. And I want to touch on that for a moment. Consider what happened with Job. That Egyptian's wife. The Egyptian whom Joseph, I said Job, I meant to say Joseph. Joseph, he was working under, for an Egyptian. And that Egyptian's wife, desired to have Joseph, desired to lay with him. And it took that divine power and influence for Joseph to refrain from that. That's no light thing, man. So the Lord kept him from sinning. It says she went down with him into the pit. When Joseph was cast into prison, being falsely accused, ultimately by that woman, that Egyptian woman that was trying to lay with Joseph. He was falsely accused and cast into prison. So it's telling you straight up that God's divine influence was with him, even in that time of hardship. Verse 14, it says, and left him not into bonds. Now, I wanted to touch on that. When you read those accounts of Joseph, the history of Joseph, after he was cast into prison, it straight up tell you, it implies that Joseph, he was literally given authority in that same prison that he was cast into. It tell you that ultimately the guardsman or the overseer of the prison ultimately gave Joseph authority, and that was by divine power. This is a power that can make your enemies to be at peace with you. A power that can give you a sway and influence on a social level. It says, for those of you who know that account, you can read that. If you don't know, read that account for yourself. It says, and left him not in bonds till she brought him the scepter of the kingdom. So Joseph, he went from a slave to having the power and authority over the entire realm of Egypt. Literally, now it tell you that Pharaoh, when you read that account, give you, some context of history. Pharaoh, he had a dream that he could not understand, and people could not interpret that dream until Joseph interpreted according to God's spirit. In God's divine wisdom, Joseph, he interpreted. And it was basically a dream, a vision concerning a famine that was going to come upon the region, upon the land, and ultimately, Joseph gave Pharaoh a counsel afterwards on how to prepare for this famine, ultimately, according to the spirit and wisdom of God. So Joseph, he gained favor before the eyes of Pharaoh. So Pharaoh basically put him on a level that is as equal unto Pharaoh himself. So God's divine power and influence and mercy was operating in the midst of Joseph's life. This is the same power that Yahweh Shai have and will ultimately use for those of you who believe. So it says, till she brought him the scepter of the kingdom and power against those that oppressed him. As for them that had accused him, she showed them to be liars and gave him perpetual glory. So that helping hand will be there. A spiritual and divine one. Let's go to the book of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 5, and I'm going to end it all with this. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1. And fellas, give verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yahweh Shai Mashiach, which according to his abundant mercy have begotten us again unto a lively hope by the resurrection of Yahweh Shai Mashiach from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept, in other words, preserved, safeguarded, says who are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. So it's through faith we have access to that divine power. Through faith in the gospel, through faith in Yahweh Shai and his death and resurrection, through faith in God as a whole, ultimately. So we have access, connection to that divine power. And some of you believers, you may not have God's power work for you as it worked for, the prophet Elisha, by whom fire rained down from heaven. Now forgive me, I think it was Elisha. If it wasn't Elisha, it was Elijah. So the power of God, it may not work for you as it in that sort. Now nothing's off the table. Miracles will be performed. By the believers, or through the believers, shall I say, through faith, by the power of God. Miraculous deliverances from evil. Maybe soldiers is near your your body. Maybe they trying to target you. Maybe they ready to kick down your door. It is written in the book of Isaiah, when the enemy's coming like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against them. So that's divine intervention. So miracles will be performed. Divine acts of God will be displayed before you believe us. But forget not the other, ways how God manifests himself. I'm going to close off on that, Lord willing, this lesson edifying. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shai. Shalom.